Happy June, y'all. And honestly, thoughts and prayers, or as the high schoolers say, T's and P's, to those of you who are still teaching as this podcast episode airs. If it makes you feel any better, I'm still semi in the trenches too, because my oldest, who is in kindergarten this year, their school is still going. And the biggest bummer is that we are switching to like a modified year-round schedule in this new school year, which I'm actually so excited about. But because of that, we have a 7-week summer this summer because we're ending so late and then we're starting so early. And I just feel like this entire year has just been so different and transitional for our family because of having him in kindergarten, having one person on this very rigid 7:45 to 2:45 schedule. And I feel like they barely have any time off. So it's really taking me back. I feel like I've been able to sympathize with y'all still who are teaching full time more so than I have been before since leaving the classroom teaching full time. And it's hard out there, you all. And I hope you had a stellar Teacher Appreciation Week a month ago and that you're just like the end of year gifts are rolling in and just giving you energy to the finish line, because our family personally is crawling towards the finish line. And it doesn't help that his little siblings, their preschool ended centuries ago. And so we're all ready for summer and he is too. But I feel like adjusting to having him on a school schedule like I said, it's been a huge transition for us, but it's also really been a big transition for my business and really thinking about how the next 3 years until all my kids are on a school schedule, every year is just going to be really, really different, having one or more children on a school schedule and then, one or more on this flexible preschool, like kind of nothing matters schedule. And then until I get to the point where, okay, in 3 years, they're all going to be in school the same time in perpetuity, it feels like, because I can't even imagine a life where my kids aren't even at home, which is crazy. I know some of y'all have big kids, but I digress. The reason I'm telling you this is I feel like, yes, this has been a huge transition, but it's probably our second biggest transition since becoming parents, with the first being actually becoming a parent for the first time. That of course was just everything changes. And I feel like not just in my life, but like in my soul, like me as a human being just changed so much when I became a parent. And I've never been one of those people that was like, I was meant to be a mom, or like I always wanted to have a family. It felt like a natural step in my future, but it wasn't like, I had friends who would always dream of the day that they had children. That was never my case. And as many of you know, we're diagnosed with unexplained infertility. So our oldest is adopted. And I remember being so nervous that the biological maternal instinct wouldn't kick in because I wasn't going through pregnancy. And that was not the case. I was so changed by becoming his mother, even if it wasn't due to biology. And so I tell you all this to say, I'm a different person and I would be a different teacher now that I'm a parent than I was when I was in the classroom full time and I did not have children of my own. And, my high schoolers were my children, if you will. And it's just, I've learned so much and I've been very, very humbled by my children. And really, as I've been thinking about this and this huge transition in our family, so much of what I've learned as I've become a parent about being a parent really applies to teaching. So not only is just my actual core essence and my literal character changed by being a parent, I'm so much softer. I have so much more grace, so much more humility, way less confidence than I used to have. It's been so iconic for me, but also I just think things that I have learned as a parent would actually make me practically teach differently, not just perceive the students differently and their parents, but truly do things differently. I'm amazed how much transfers. So all of that to say, I'm excited to share these things with you. And I won't give this context every time, don't worry. But this month, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share things that I've learned from parenting that I feel like apply to teaching, are principles that you can use in your home if you're listening and you have kids, or if, of course, you're listening, you should be a teacher. Because if listening and you're not a teacher or an admin, hit up my DMs and let me know how you found me and what you're doing here, because I would love to hear from you. But assuming you're all teachers, because this is a Secondary Science Simplified podcast, how you can use these principles in your classroom. And so the first one we're going to talk about this week is this concept of using refrains. Refrains are things that I used all the time in my classroom, and I use them all the time now at home with my kids. And so many of the ones that I'm using with my 2, 4, and 6-year-old, I would use with 14 through 18-year-olds as well if I was in the classroom right now. So let's stop gabbing and let's get right to it. And I'm going to share with you how to use refrains when teaching and or parenting. This is Secondary Science Simplified, a podcast for secondary science teachers who want to engage their students and simplify their lives. I'm Rebecca Joyner from It's Not Rocket Science. As a high school science teacher turned curriculum writer, I am passionate about helping other science teachers love their jobs, serve their students, and do it all in only 40 hours a week. Are you ready to rock the time you spend in your classroom and actually have a life outside of it? You are in the right place, teacher friend. Let's get to today's episode. Okay, so I should probably start off with what is a refrain? So you can look up the definition, but it's just a repeated line in a song. So I think about how I can remember lyrics that I listened to on my burn CDs that I made from LimeWire in 2004. And I cannot even remember what time I'm supposed to pick up certain children. It's honestly disturbing how we can remember song lyrics. But I feel like the reason is, especially with refrains, is you're just listening to the same thing over and over, and it's attached to this rhythm and this kind of cadence in the song. And so I found that I had certain refrains in my classroom, and now I have certain refrains that I'm using over and over in my home. And I tend to say them the same type of way and or with the same cadence or with the same type of voice or the same volume. And because of that, it makes them really memorable. And it also makes them really mimickable. My kids mimic me all the time. My former students used to memorize them and mimic me. And it had such a benefit. So why do I love them? Well, one, I feel like I become a voice in my children's heads, and I was a voice in my former students' heads. They start to hear my voice in the certain ways that I say things over and over again. So when they're working on that one problem and they're trying to figure out the answer, or for my kids, when they're in the middle of a conflict and they're trying to figure out where do we go from here other than just running straight to mom, they feel equipped because they've heard my voice and my voice is in their head. And so I love that idea of being with them in their heads, even when I'm not physically with them. And that, especially that idea of equipping them to do things and make decisions and push through even when I'm not there to hold their hand through it. And then the second reason I love it is my kids have started to manage each other oftentimes during playtime conflict, or when we're on a play date and we have friends over, they can start managing the situation just like my students can start managing each other. I cannot tell you how many times, things would get going in the classroom. Someone would say something and then another student would say one of my refrains, something that I always say. They would repeat it for me before I even had to say a breath. And then it just everyone would laugh and listen to it and move forward. And it's just amazing how this happened without even trying. This is not something I intentionally set out to do. It was just something that innately and organically happened. And it was amazing, the impact from it. And I loved them. And because of that, I became much more intentional with how I use them. So you probably have so many of your own refrains and you don't even realize it. I'm going to give you examples for the remainder of this episode, but this is a fun thing. If you are still in the classroom, God bless you. If your school year is not done, ask your students, what do they hear you constantly saying? Or what are things I always say? Or, sometimes, your seniors might have an end of year skit or roast or something they do of teachers. If they're going to make a joke on you, if someone was going to dress up for you as Miss Joyner for Halloween, what would be the types of things that Miss Joyner would be saying in her costume or whatever? Get them, ask their questions, see what they would say. And if you're out of the school year, I'm so excited for you. Use some time, when you're watching your kids swim in the pool or you're on a walk with your dog, think through what are things I'm always saying. Okay. So I'm going to share mine with you. There are a couple of these that I really use in my household too. And so I'll denote that just so you know, this is a good one to use with my literal children too, not just my students. But then I'm also going to share the context in which I would use this in the classroom. Okay. So I got 5 refrains for you and then a couple other bonus ones. So first is this refrain, peacemakers and problem solvers. Again, I didn't come up with this. I can't even remember the first person I heard say this, but now I've said it so much, it just feels innate with my DNA. And so what it looks like is if there is some sort of conflict, I would use this when students are fighting or my children are fighting, or in the classroom, if they're having a hard time working together as a group and I can feel and or hear and see the tension building, I would step in and say, peacemakers and problem solvers. And then I would say, what would it look like to either one, create peace here, or two, problem solve here? Okay. And so this idea of just that jotted refrain, peacemakers and problem solvers, I just like kind of holler it at them, is reminding them of who they are. You are someone that can create peace, and you are someone that can solve problems. Okay. You probably can create problems too, but I really want you to focus on the fact that you can solve problems. These are life skills I want every child in my home and student in my classroom to walk away with. So I think there's something really powerful about speaking an identity over someone, even before they've maybe stepped into that. And so me telling them and speaking over them, you are a peacemaker and you are a problem solver, is giving them confidence and really equipping them to be like, you know what, I am. Like, I can do that. And it also reminds them too, I don't know about you, but when I'm in a conflict or like a high stress situation, or I know like my friends especially that struggle with being people pleasers more than me, when the noise starts getting loud and the conflict starts brewing, or, the overstimulation starts happening, I think of like me and my kids, it's hard to think clearly. It is hard to problem solve. It's hard to strategize. It's hard to remember, like, where do I go from here that isn't me just yelling at these students or silent screaming into a plate while I'm attempting to like get dinner ready for my kids. Okay. But when you have these refrains, you can remember in those moments of chaos, or have someone speak over you like you would do for your students. Hey, remember, peacemakers and problem solvers, or you're a peacemaker and a problem solver. Where can we go from here? Remind them of who they are. And then that almost like helps in the middle of the chaos, give them goalposts of, okay, I can make peace here. I can problem solve here. It reminds them of what they can do as opposed to just be overwhelmed in the conflict, and they can hopefully move forward from there. So that's one refrain I absolutely love. The second refrain I love is, that sounds like a problem and you're a problem solver. So this is adjacent to the last one, but I use this more of the context of someone complaining. Okay, so the first one is like, there's a fight, there's conflict. I'm going to step in and remind them, hey, let's be peacemakers and problem solvers, or you are peacemakers and problem solvers. This one is where a student or a child comes to me and just starts complaining about something. Like, I don't like this. I'm starving. This problem is so hard. I don't know how to solve it. And you can say, you're acknowledging, hey, that does sound like a problem, but you're a problem solver. So again, you're acknowledging that there's a problem, even if it feels like a silly one, like a child who says they're hungry 2.5 seconds after they finish a snack. But you're also equipping them by saying, and you're a problem solver. You can do something about this. And if they follow up with that by melting down even further, and I'm really seeing this more when my 2-year-old, not necessarily maybe your 16-year-old in your classroom, you can say, hey, do you need my help coming up with a solution? And then that gives them an opportunity to ask for help in humility. And then you to kind of step in and say, okay, like, let's brainstorm this together. I'm not just going to give you a solution, but I'm willing to offer you help in coming up with a solution. Okay. So that sounds like a problem and you're a problem solver. I use this so much in my household and with my students. Another one that's, also adjacent to this for my high schoolers, and this one's a little bit sassier. So I would not say this to my 4-year-old daughter. This would not go over well with her, but is I would often shout personal problem to my students, but in a kind way. I'm not shouting at them personal problem, but oftentimes I just found they just complained and were so negative and about things that they were making a big deal out of that shouldn't be a big deal out of, or they were getting off topic or complaining about things that like, okay, you're just having like a personal issue with this right now. This is not a me issue. This is not a classroom issue. This is like a you issue. Not Taylor Swift, it's me, hi, I'm the problem, it's me. No, it's you, you're the problem, it's you. Okay, but we're going to say it nicer, but just saying, hey, like, that's a personal problem. Stay focused. Okay. Or like, we can talk about this later, but that's a personal problem. It's not a Miss Joyner problem. It's not your lab group problem. It's not a classroom problem. And so that's something else I would consider too. And you guys, you know how to read the room. Maybe that's not one that's going to work for you. Like, that's a little bit too aggressive of a refrain to point at a student and say personal problem, but it became one that was funny in my classroom and that they would laugh at. And it was definitely one that I got mocked for when it came to like a senior skit and someone was dressing up as Miss Joyner, is me pointing at people and saying personal problem. And an example of this is, I think I've talked to you guys about, for me, I want nothing to know about your bowel movements. Please don't ask me to go to the bathroom. I don't need you to check in with me. I have a system that runs in place. You write your name on the board, you take the pass, you go. When you come back, you hang the pass up, you erase your name, game over. I don't need to know that you're going to have a bowel movement. And nothing actually makes me angrier than when I'm trying to like explain a lab or something and you interrupt me to ask if you can use the restroom. Just go do it. And so one of the ways that this would come up was if a student forgot that policy, I could be like, personal problem, figure it out yourself. Essentially you're saying figure it out yourself, but it's a little bit not as kind as saying that sounds like a problem and you're a problem solver. That one's a little bit more equipping. So maybe read the room, but some sort of refrain like that has been extremely useful and repetitive in my home and in my classroom. Another one that's definitely, this is my third one. It's definitely one that I used in the classroom and I do not use at home at all, at least with my kids' ages, but is the refrain. It's simply the word irrelevant. And I would like shout it as loud as I could, just irrelevant. And this would happen. I could be in the middle of explaining the central dogma and I could just shout irrelevant. And it would be when I eavesdrop on them getting off topic. My kids used to always say I had supersonic hearing. Like they were like, I don't know how you heard us saying that. And I'm like, it's amazing the things I can hear. I'd tell you. But I would shout irrelevant. If they're asking a question that has nothing to do with what we're talking about, I would shout irrelevant. And again, I'm not trying to be rude here. Like all questions are good questions. It's not that I don't want to answer them, but sometimes it's, I'm just trying to hit the basics here and not overwhelm all your classmates. And if you ask something super deep, it could derail us. Or, hey, we may not have time. And so now's not a good time to ask this. So irrelevant was kind of my response. But the real reason I saw this is, those students that are purposely trying to get you off topic. Like they are trying to get in there and get you on a rant on something, yapping about something. And they just want to get you off topic so that you don't get through the content. And that's when you're like, hey, love ya, but irrelevant. We're going to stay on task. Circle back at the end of class if we have more time on this. So irrelevant was another refrain I used a lot. My fourth refrain, and this is again another classroom specific one, not in my home, but is use your notes, not your neighbor. So I cannot tell you how many times I've said this. Again, every student I've probably ever had could repeat this. The context I'm using this for is during prime times, which are my bell ringers. I really feel like the first 5 minutes of class is the most important part of the class period. That's why since my student teaching, I started calling this time prime time, and the bell ringers that they do my prime times. I can link the ones I have pre-made in the show notes. I also have episodes about this. Episode 4 and episode 91 are podcast episodes where I talk about prime times and how I do them and all of that jazz. But the idea is for me, for bell ringers, this is twofold. One, it's a classroom management strategy of we get in and we start working the second you get into class. It really just sets the tone for the class. But also two, it's an assessment strategy because I barely grade anything for accuracy. And so this is one of the things I do grade for accuracy, but it's not about having everything memorized the day after you learned it. It's about equipping students to use their own resources, their own tools, their own notes, their own mind, their own homework practice questions, their own notes from tutoring to answer questions. Like I want you to use all your resources, but I want you also to do it on your own and not just be immediately going to your neighbor and trying to get the answer. So because of that, I let my students do all their bell ringers open note as long as they're not talking to a neighbor. I have to train this hard at the beginning of the year that this is how we do things. And I will tell them, like, if I hear any whispers at all, hey, use your notes, not your neighbor. If I hear it again, notes are gone. You think you want to use your neighbor instead of your notes? Like, let's see, and that was really kept them on task and kept them just using their notes because they realized I'm actually more trustworthy than the person sitting next to me and the notes that I already took. So that is a huge refrain that I used. And I think another reason I feel really passionate about this concept of use your notes, not your neighbor, is I've just noticed this more and more in the last few years. And I haven't even been in the classroom full time. So I'm sure y'all can correct me if I'm wrong. I feel like this is a lot though from what I'm hearing from you guys in my messages is this generation is constantly trying to like offload and deflect and or like not take ownership for their actions. I don't know if it's because if this is bred from the apathy we've seen post-pandemic or I don't know, this like concept of like learned helplessness, it just feels like is so rampant. And that's why I'm obsessed with these statements. You're a peacemaker and a problem solver. That sounds like a problem and you're a problem solver. Like use your notes and not your neighbor. Like you can do this. Okay. I think I especially see this so much in my son, even more so than my daughter. Anything that happens, it's someone else's fault, except for my son's. He's constantly blaming, whereas my daughter, everything is her fault. Like she's constantly internalizing and absorbing blame that is not due her, whereas my son is constantly dumping blame off of himself on other things. If something gets lost, his first question is always like, where did you put my sunglasses? And I'm like, why does that have to be me and where I put it? Maybe you just misplaced them. It's not my problem. And I think this cycle gets fed because my son does this to my daughter. She continues to absorb it. We're really working on this. Side note for parents listening, some of the best parenting books I've ever read are by Sissy Goff and David Thomas. I'll link them in the show notes. Their first one is Are My Kids on Track? And it basically goes through some like developmental and mental milestones for kids. And again, you always have to hold these things loosely. Every kid is going to grow and develop at their own rate. But I just thought I never thought about like emotional milestones for my kids and social ones. I was always kind of thinking, you go to your 2-month, your 4-month, your 6-month baby checkup and you're looking for these physical things. But it's a really interesting book about kind of, affirming like, it's very normal for my 6-year-old boy to be like extremely aggressive physically. Like that's a normal physical developmental thing and behavioral thing in boys that they develop at this age. It's so that I really appreciate that book. And then they have 2 others. One is Raising Emotionally Strong Boys, which I love. It's kind of like combating the concept of be tough and toughen up or suck it up, which was kind of the refrain of my childhood for every boy that I knew. And then kind of the counterpart book to that is Raising Worry-Free Girls and just trying to combat anxiety, which, it's all over the place now, but it's especially prevalent in girls. Really interesting books. I'll link them all in the show notes. But when I was reading one of those books, I can't remember which one it was, it talked about how this concept is so common, so much more common in boys. This idea that boys deflect ownership of their actions and we have to train them and push them and equip them to humble themselves and be willing to own a mistake and it actually be their fault and also realize they can be a part of the solution. And then on the other hand, girls are prone, and again, everything's different. I can't just generalize everything to these 2 categories, but you can read the books and think about it for yourself. But just this concept of like girls constantly making everything their fault and then teaching them like you don't need to absorb all these things or carry all these things that aren't yours. So that is like a crazy tangent on this concept of use your notes, not your neighbor, but it's something I've thought about so much. And I feel really passionate about equipping these students and these children, whether they're boys, girls, whatever, like it doesn't matter, but equipping them to take ownership and trust themselves and be like, okay, what can I do? What can I bring to this table? Instead of constantly just expecting other people to help me, to defend me, to give me the answers, to carry me across the finish line of the graduation stage. And then my 5th refrain I want to share with you is one that I've used so much in my home. I never used this in my classroom because it wasn't something I'd really ever thought about, but now I think it would be so helpful to use in the classroom. And it's this refrain of seeing rather than being seen. And I feel like this is something, if I'm going to get really personal with you, like God has placed on my heart personally recently. And I know everyone listening here, doesn't have the same belief system that I have, and that's totally fine. But I'm just being transparent. Where this originally came from was like, I really felt one day God said to me, I want you to walk into this room. It was a women's conference, and I was like speaking on a panel. And he's like, I want you to care more about seeing others than being seen when you walk in here. And it's really changed my whole life, and it's starting to change our family's culture. Okay, here's the context for which I use it. On our way to school, on our way to the park, on our way to a kid's birthday party. Okay, I'll remind my kids, okay, when we get there, let's see others more than we care about being seen by others. Okay, so like, what does that look like? It looks like using your eyes to see if there's someone who's not being included, using your words to invite them into play. It's about considering others better than yourself and like not having to be the first in line, but pushing someone else ahead of you in line gently. And you taking a step back, you not having to be the first one, seeing others rather than being seen. And it's a hard reminder, but I think it's so important. And I especially push this one too when we have people over at our house. We're big into hosting and having people over for dinner and all those things. And I'm always saying like, okay, before our friends get here, what are some ways we can see them rather than being seen? And we give some practical examples of like, we've talked about this so much. Hey, you get to play with these toys all the time. Your friends, this is like the first time they're getting to play with your Maui hook that you got at Disney on Ice 2 years ago that your Mimi bought you. So if they want to play with the Maui hook, let's let them have a turn. Let's see them instead of worrying about you getting seen playing with it and doing things your way. Like, you're going to get to play with it all night long. You can sleep with the Maui hook. I don't care. So that's one way we've used it in our home. I think a way I could foresee using this if I was still in the classroom is when you see that student who's just trying to get attention, or when you see that student that's really struggling with their pride and, you're having maybe a one-on-one conversation with them and they cannot ask for help. They're just blaming you for why you took off this half point and you're wrong. And it's really like, no, or maybe it's in group work and just the group work dynamics can be so hard. Just teaching our students like, hey, let's see others rather than caring about ourselves being seen. So like in a conflict with an individual student one-on-one where they're judging you and what you did wrong as opposed to seeing maybe what they did wrong on the test, say like, hey, I want you to see me here rather than seeing yourself. Do you think I'm genuinely out here to get you? I want to take off every point that I can. No, like I'm rooting for you. I'm cheering for you. And then you can explain. Or again, in that group work being like, okay, especially if it's like a project and there's a presentation, okay, let's see other people. Let's make that the priority. So those are 5 examples of refrains I've used in my house, in my school, some both, some only one or the other. But I think they're hopefully helpful for giving you some ideas. A couple more I'll like not get into all the details with, but I had a lot of content specific ones too. In biology, I think I said proteins are everything or proteins matter 20 times a day. If there is one thing my students learned when they left my biology class is like proteins are everything. Proteins do everything. Everything about the cell is about making proteins because they run your show. That was another one. Proteins run your show. When we teach evolution, I'm constantly saying organisms do not evolve. Populations do. Organisms do not evolve. Populations do. Over and over and over again. Anatomy and really biology, form dictates function. Okay? Form dictates function. So when they're on that test and they're trying to figure out like, oh yeah, what does this body part do again? Well, let me look at its form. Let me look at its shape because typically the shape will inform what it actually does. And then in my quantitative science classes, like a physical science, chemistry, I'm constantly saying like, when in doubt, work it out. If you're not 100% sure of that quantitative answer, work through the problem again. Better yet, I would say when in doubt, rework it out. Take the answer you got and plug it all the way back through in the beginning and see if you can work your way down and you get back to the original answer I gave you. Obviously, you don't have time to do this for every question, but it's one of those where like mark the ones you're a little bit unsure of on the test, circle back at the end of the test, and when in doubt, rework it out and see if you get the same answer. Again, I hope these examples helped you. I felt like I got a little off the rails with so many personal things, so hopefully that wasn't TMI. You can DM me and let me know if it was. But here's what I want to challenge you with before I go. 1, ask your students what they hear you saying a lot. If you're still in the classroom right now, you're still teaching this school year. 2, I would say, if not, if you're already out, reflect on it on your own and see if you can think of your own refrains that you say a lot. And then 3, whether you have any or not, be strategic about thinking through what are some new refrains? What are some things that matter to me and I want to matter to my students? Content specific ones. Like, what are the most important things they leave biology knowing or leave chemistry knowing or leave physics knowing? Make a refrain about them. Or if there are these life skills, peacemakers and problem solvers, like if you are really care about them being passionate about that, let's be strategic about coming up with a few of those refrains and using them next school year and getting them into your students' minds. And you know what I would love, y'all? If you have been listening to this and thinking of your own refrains like you already know you say, will you please DM me on Instagram? If you just search It's Not Rocket Science, you should see me come up, Rebecca Joyner. My like actual handle is like it's.not.rocket.science. Kind of annoying, all the dots. But I would like love to hear from you. And I have like a love-hate relationship with social media. I have like my posts on a scheduler so I can post every day, but it's just not something I like to jump on every day. But I will tell you this, I read every DM. Okay, on Instagram. I don't log into Facebook really ever. So I'm really sorry for those of you who've messaged me on Facebook. I read my emails, but I do have someone help me with my emails, but not my DMs. That's me. Okay. So if you want to tell me, I will read it. So I would love to hear your refrains. And if we get a bunch of good ones, I can share them, throughout the rest of the month or something like that. So I would love it if you haven't already left a review. If you would do that for the podcast, it's just such an encouragement to hear from you. But if you use refrains already with your students, let me know in the reviews for the podcast and the ratings. And I know I mentioned some books and some other podcast episodes in this episode. So if you want to be able to like click on those really easily If you go to the show notes, there, it's not rocket science classroom.com/episode 133. You can also usually access them in that link in your podcast player. Go there. You'll see all these clickable links and you can snag those. And if you end up reading those parenting books, I'd love to hear what you think. So DM me, let me know. All right, teacher friends, that wraps up today's episode. If you're looking for an easy way to start simplifying your life as a secondary science teacher, head to itsnotrocketscienceclassroom.com/challenge to grab your classroom reset challenge. And guess what? It's totally free. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll see you here next week. Until then, I'll be rooting for you, teacher friend.